I've always been a bit of a gear nerd. As a kid, I would flip through the pages of the Dance Comp catalog until they fell out, and nowadays, I try to avoid doing that quite so much so I don't get too materialistic, but every once in a while, I can't help but succumb to the temptation to dream about my favorite bikes that I hope to one day ride. And that's exactly what I'm doing today. And I've decided to invite you guys along into my bike-obsessed brain and explore 5 hardtail frames that I would love to be able to get a chance to ride in 2023. Along the way, I'll break down the frame geometry and any other pertinent frame features and let you know why I chose that particular frame for this top 5 list. As you're watching, if you would please go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button, that would be awesome. That helps this channel out a ton. But without further ado, let's jump into that first frame, which is one you've probably all heard a lot about lately. It's the 2023 Marin San Quentin. The Marin San Quentin and I have a bit of a history. It's actually something I've already talked about on this channel a little bit when I talked about the brand new 2023 San Quentin, and I'll go ahead and put that link down here in the description. But suffice to say, the changes that they've made for this 2023 model were enough to not only make it onto this list, but actually to make it into my hands. I have a 2023 San Quentin 3 coming to my house. It should be there within the next couple weeks or months, and you know I'm going to be doing a review video on that. But today, we're going to focus just on this frame and why I think it's one of the best frames that you can get right now if you're into playful, aggressive trail riding. I've been on record on this channel of calling this one of the most radical hardtails that you can buy today. And I've gotten some backlash on that. But the thing that I'm talking about is the super low seat tube. The size large has a seat tube length of just 375 millimeters. That's about 50 millimeters less than other aggressive hardtails that are already in that low seat tube category, like say the Kona Hanzo ESD, which has a 420 millimeter seat tube. As a recovering BMX addict, I love bikes with a short seat tube, and that's the #1 reason why this bike made it on my list, but it's definitely not the only reason. In addition to lowering that seat tube, Marin has also bumped up the stack to 631.5 millimeters. And as a taller rider, I'm really thankful for that. No matter what size you get of this bike, it comes with 27.5-inch wheels, which I really think speaks to the kind of BMX or dirt jump inspired nature of this bike. It also has a very average reach of 470 millimeters on the size large and a very average 64-degree head tube angle. Another average number is the chainstay length, which is 425 millimeters. But from there, we start to see things depart a little bit and some numbers that I'm maybe not as stoked about, but I'm actually really excited to try when the bike gets to my doorstep here in a couple weeks. First up is the bottom bracket drop. You guys know that I like bikes with a higher bottom bracket because it makes them feel poppier, easier to bunny hop and manual, but the San Quentin has a relatively low bottom bracket with a drop of 50 millimeters. It's also got a really steep seat tube at 77 degrees. As someone who likes a smaller feeling frame when I'm riding to make it that much more kind of nimble and playful, I actually like to have a slacker seat tube so I don't feel super cramped while pedaling. But if you're someone who likes to have a really long reach when you're standing but don't want to feel too stretched out when you're sitting down, then you're going to really like that 77-degree seat tube on the San Quentin. Outside of the geometry, there's a few other features that I like about this frame. #1, it has ISCG tabs. I feel like this is getting less and less common on frames these days, and as someone who likes technical rocky riding and street jibbing, I like to be able to have a bash guard and a chain guide just to protect things that much more. It's also got a tapered head tube, which gives you that really clean look, having your whole headset enclosed in the frame, so I like that as well. Shifter and dropper post cables are both going to be run internally with an externally routed brake cable, which makes it nice so you won't have to bleed your brakes if and when you have to take them off. And if you've liked the sound of all that, then you're gonna love this last part about the Marin San Quentin. The frame only costs $549, which is dirt cheap. All in all, this looks like a really interesting and fun frame, so I'm excited to say that this is one on this list that I will be riding this year, and I can't wait to tell you guys all about it. The next bike on my list might just be one of the prettiest aluminum hardtail frames on the market today and really ever. And that's the Banshee Enigma. Now, if that name doesn't sound familiar to you, just picture a scaled down version of its bigger brother, the Banshee Paradox. Outside of some geometry changes, the Paradox and the Enigma frames look basically identical, which is a good thing because, like I said earlier, this really is a beautiful frame. Now, I've never ridden one of Banshee's hardtails, but I've heard from other people, specifically Steve at Hardtail Party, that they're some of the most compliant aluminum frames on the market. And it makes sense. If you look at the machining and the chainstays, the yokes, the dropouts, you can see that Banshee has put a ton of work into making this bike strong, but supple. The Enigma frame is spec'd to run 140 to 160 millimeter fork, and with 150 millimeter fork is super slack at 63.5 degrees. That tends to be slacker than I would like, so if I were to hypothetically get this bike one day, talking to you, Banshee, then I might run an angle adjust headset to steepen that up just a little bit, as I think it makes the bike a little more playful at slower speed. The size large frame has a 475mm reach, matched with a 631mm stack height. The seat tube is right about average, maybe a little bit on the shorter side for an aggressive hardtail at 440mm on the size large, but something that's not average at all is what Banshee's gone ahead and done with the seat tube angle. They actually have different seat tube angles depending on the frame size. And you might be wondering why a company would do that. This will make it so the seat tube doesn't feel too steep for shorter riders with smaller frames, but also not too slack for taller riders like myself who are running a longer seat tube. It's also got some nice and short 418mm chainstays in a relatively high bottom bracket at just 42mm. Those two things combined should make this bike feel really poppy and playful, and that ride characteristic has been confirmed by people who have ridden this bike. I'll go ahead and put down the review for this frame that Steve from Hardtail Party did if you want to hear from somebody who's actually put pedal time on this frame. Just like the San Quentin, this Banshee does have a tapered head tube, but all the cables are routed externally, which should make it extra easy to work on. This beautiful frame isn't cheap though. It's actually going to set you back $1,149, which is one of the reasons why I'm probably not going to get a chance to ride this year, but boy would I love to. Speaking of expensive frames that I'll probably never ride, the next bike on this list is the Reeb Redikyelous, which is Jeff Lanowski's signature bike. And just like Jeff's riding style, this bike screams fun. Sadly, however, it also screams expensive. The frame itself costs $2,395. But with that out of the way, let's talk about all the great stuff that just might make this bike worth the price. I recently rode my first ever steel hardtail, the Rip Cycles Basic 29, and I was blown away by the difference that a steel frame felt over aluminum. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to include a steel frame on this list. And Reeb is one of the best companies to do it. Reeb has been making super high quality, good looking steel bikes for years. This one in particular is the most aggressive yet and rolls on 29-inch wheels with a 65-degree head tube angle. You guys know by now that I like short seat tubes, and this has got one of the shortest ones on the list, coming in at just 425mm. Another neat feature is that this frame actually features size-specific chainstays. So the small and medium frames will get a 410mm chainstay, and the large and extra large will get 420mm. It has a reach of 465mm and a stack of 643mm, making it the highest stacked size large on this list. Just like the Banshee, Reeb has opted for external cable routing on this guy, with only the dropper post being routed internally. And while the geometry of this frame is definitely spot on, I honestly think it's the frame quality and the fact that it's handmade in Colorado that makes this bike really that much more special. You can also bet that this bike is going to ride super well and last a super long time. Jeff Lanowski pushes this thing hard and is always inspiring me to go out and play in my hardtail, whether that's doing kind of jibby trials tricks or sending big jumps. If his name is attached to this bike, I know it's going to be super, super solid. And while all that awesome stuff about this frame is true, $2,000 is still a lot to spend on a frame. So let's go ahead and move on to my next bike, the Dartmoor Hornet. Dartmoor bikes are pretty hard to come by here in the States, but they have a huge following over in Europe. And their Hornet Pro, which essentially is their free ride hardtail, is a seriously cool bike. The looks of this frame are definitely polarizing. It's got big, thick aluminum tubing that's really angular and kind of angry looking. It's honestly the exact opposite of that super clean steel Redikyelous frame that we just looked at. But I still like both of those styles. And one thing I like about this frame is, as aggressive as it looks, they've still kind of kept the geometry under control. It's got a 64-degree head tube angle, which I think is just about perfect, paired with a 150mm fork. The 460mm reach and 625mm stack height are just about average, as is the 73-degree seat tube angle. Speaking to the kind of free ride and slope style nature of this bike, it's got a pretty high bottom bracket with just 35mm of drop and 425mm chainstays. The seat tube is 440mm long, which is right about average, but that top tube dips down really low before kind of coming back up to meet the seat tube, which should give this bike a lot of standover clearance. The cable routing on this bike is fully external, and I'm thankful to say that it does come with ISCG tabs. One thing I'm not thankful about though is how hard it is to get your hands on a Dartmoor here in the States. I couldn't find any evidence of anyone distributing it stateside, and couldn't even find pricing information online. There's a few used frames and complete builds floating around Pinkbike, but other than that, you're kind of screwed if you want a Dartmoor in America. That being said, if you live on the other side of the pond and you want a really mean, aggressive looking hardtail, then this one's going to be hard to beat. The last bike on this list is by far the one that I am most excited to talk about, and that is the RSD RS-291. And not just any RS-291, the Titanium version. You might remember this bike when I talked about the top 10 aggressive hardtails to get in 2023. This bike was in there in that highest price category, and for good reason. RSD has gone all in on this frame. It's beautiful. Titanium is an amazing metal choice for frames. It's lightweight, it's supple, it's rust and corrosion resistant. It really could be the last frame you'd ever need to buy. And another reason why I'm so excited about this frame is that I'm pretty sure I'm going to get the chance to ride it this year. I'm going to be working as a brand ambassador for RSD once again in 2023, and Alex, the owner there, is going to be sending me a few bikes out throughout the year to demo and kind of tell you guys all about them and get you up to speed on those bikes. And I really hope that this Titanium RS-291 can be one of those. By now, I'm sure most of you guys know that my personal bike is an RSD middle child, which is kind of the 27.5-inch play bike that RSD makes, whereas the RS-291 is more of a 29-inch enduro bike. I'm usually more of a fan of the smaller wheels and less aggressive geo, but I'm excited to try this bike out because I think it's really pushing the boundaries of what can be done on a hardtail. The size large has a pretty long reach of 477 millimeters, a stack height of 646 millimeters, and a very slack head tube of 63.5 degrees. I'm thankful that RSD hasn't gone too crazy with the seat tube. It's relatively steep at 75.3 degrees, but we're not talking 76 or 77 like a lot of other hardtail frames are doing these days. Speaking to the high speed intentions of this frame, it does have the lowest bottom bracket of any bike on my list with a drop of 55 millimeters. But that's still not too big compared to some other bikes like the Honzo ESD, which has a 60 or maybe even 62 millimeter drop. Like all of RSD's bikes, the RS-291 comes with adjustable chainstays ranging from 420 to 435 millimeters. So you can shorten it up for a more jibby ride or pull it out for extra stability during your enduro race. RSD has also kept the seat tube relatively short at just 440 millimeters. So what do you get if you combine a titanium frame with perfect geometry from an awesome Canadian-based brand? Well, you get the most expensive frame on this list, coming in at $2,599. That's $2,000 more than the cheapest bike on this list, that Marin San Quentin. It's important to keep in mind, though, not only the material cost of titanium, but also the super complex manufacturing process that goes into welding these frames that really adds to that price. But as I mentioned, I'm pretty sure that I'm actually going to be able to ride both the cheapest and most expensive frame on this list sometime this year. So I'll be able to get a good perspective of what that extra $2,000 actually gets you when we're talking about hardtail frames. And you know that I'll be sharing that with you guys in a video. So there you go, a little deep dive into my brain and the frames that I would love to ride at some point this year. While these bikes all may seem relatively similar at face value, I mean they're all aggressive but still playful hardtails, there's some pretty significant details in terms of frame construction, frame material, and even geometry that set these bikes apart. As I mentioned earlier, I'm super excited to be riding at least 2 of these this year. I'll definitely be filling you in on my thoughts on those once I actually get some pedal time in. As always, I'd love to know if you have any personal experience with any of the frames on this list that you could share with me, because like I said, I actually haven't ridden any of them just yet. While you're down there, go ahead and hit that like, hit the subscribe, then grab your bike, and hopefully I'll see you out there, maybe even on one of these new frames.